Hey everyone, welcome to the Unhandled Exception Podcast. I'm Dan Clark and this is episode number 82. And today I'm joined for the third time on the show by James World, a principal solution architect, public speaker, good friend, and probably one of the most knowledgeable people I know. So welcome back to the show, James.
Thanks, Dan. You're very flattering as always. Good to be back.
I'm looking back at the dates and both episodes were 2021, so 4 years ago.
Wow.
Your first one, learning and self-development. So all the listeners, I would definitely recommend listening to that one. Episode 16, so quite a while ago.
Yeah, that was a good podcast recording, actually. But I think it's one of the things that we should probably touch on today because, AI has certainly changed some of the landscape around hiring, for sure.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff we'll talk about today. And the episode 23 as well, where that was actually a joint episode with Jesse Liberty, who were talking about Git.
Yeah. One of my favorite topics, actually, still. Doesn't go away.
Well, again, as you say, it's kind of like that might tie in today with like Git, and because obviously AI does stuff with Git because it can do stuff with PRs and that kind of thing. And even like commit messages are English and AI can interact with that. So that's probably an angle we can take as well.
Absolutely, yeah.
So this, as we kind of alluded to, this is going to be another episode on AI. I feel I should rename the show to something like the Unhandled Language Model or something like that. But in this topic, obviously, there's so many different things we can talk about in this space. Before we dig in, though, could you just introduce yourself to the listeners and tell us a bit about what you do?
Sure, yeah. So I started computing very young. I think my father got a Spectrum for Christmas when I was around 6, and within 3 weeks it was in my room, so he could have his study back. And then, professionally, since the mid-90s, I worked for quite a while as a consultant. I'm kind of back in the full-time game now, but I guess the past sort of 10 years or so been pretty much in that architecture role, sort of as a leader of software development teams. Still very much stay hands on the code. But as an architect as well, then I interact a lot with the business, kind of bridging the gap between technology teams and the business teams. And that's a really interesting space to be in right now when it comes to AI, because companies are doing a lot of figuring out how they should use and work with AI.
Yeah, definitely. We've known each other for quite a few years as well, and mainly from the user group I run, .NET Oxford, and you've done lots of different talks, full-length talks, lightning talks and stuff, and yeah, every talk you do, I learn something new. So, and we've got one next week, haven't we? The 9th.
Yeah, I'm going to mention Microsoft Agent Framework later in the podcast, and yeah, I'm doing a talk specifically on that with quite a nice demo where we recreate Claude Code or a CLI-like coding assistant in under 100 lines of code, so it should be fun.
I'm kind of like, I'm aware that the listeners are probably going to be like, is that going to be recorded? Which we don't actually record those talks. So yeah, we need to talk a lot about that in this episode just to make sure we've captured that side of things.
For sure.
But yeah, the agent framework definitely sounds quite interesting. And yeah, writing Claude Code in 100 lines, do you say?
Yeah, less than. Yes, it is 99, but I didn't have to struggle to get it under 100. So that's shows the power of the framework, I think.
And you've not put like a million lines, but just no line returns. So it's all one big massive line.
Well, actually, just to be super fun, I literally did it in one file. So I used that new feature in .NET 10 where you can just have a C# file that you can just run immediately. So there's no project file, none of the other sort of detritus that you get around a .NET project. It's literally just one 99 line file.
I still need to play with that actually, because I know that ties in a lot with the new Aspire stuff as well, where you can have like the app host being just leveraging that one file. So you don't have to have a whole project. But yeah, it's on my long list of things to play with.
Yeah, I think it's a fun feature. I don't think it's a necessary feature. It definitely has some use cases around creating sort of scripting. I think it's much nicer to write a C# script than, say, a PowerShell script in a lot of scenarios. So the fact that you can make it execute, put a shebang in it and make it executable like you can a bash script, it's pretty cool.
We probably just need the tooling to catch up, I guess, with all the different things. I can imagine, because I use LinkPad quite a lot. I know, so we're going off tangent, but very briefly, I use LinkPad a lot. And I know the dump command in LinkPad I found really, really powerful. But there is a NuGet package called Dumpify, which does the same thing. So I can picture using this new C# thing where you can just do .NET Run and then a C# file and the Dumpify NuGet package to actually get that nice output as well. I can see that being quite a powerful combination.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I do think that single file capability or the runnable file. Actually, that's one of the problems. Like, I don't think there's a good name for the feature. I think I've heard it called .NET Run app.cs in the Microsoft docs because it's not really, it's just the ability to execute C#. And there have been if you search for it, you find like the native compilation into a standalone executable. Yeah, at least I do. So yeah, it can be tricky to find the feature, but it's a good one. Yeah.
I guess it becomes like a script, but then there was things in the past. Was it CS script, which or what?
Exactly. Yeah, you find that if you try and search the other way.
Before we dive into, well, the topic is AI in the enterprise, I'm just going to do a few usual reminders to the listeners. So firstly, this podcast has its own Discord community. If you head over to the website unhandledexceptionpodcast.com, you'll see the Discord link there. And also, I have a monthly newsletter where I send out handpicked developer news items from the past month. It also includes a dev pick and a dev comic pick, as well as podcast updates about the show. It's a great way to keep up to date with developer news. If you want to sign up, there's a subscribe link on the podcast website, or go to my website, danclark.com, for links to that and all my things, including my socials and my blog. And lastly, a quick reminder that this podcast is brought to you by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. Right, okay, so let's dive in. So as I say, the general theme today is using AI in the enterprise. And I know in our shared notes, there's a ton of stuff. So I have no idea the best place to start, so I'm going to let you kick this one off.
I think the first thing I wanted to say is that I don't consider myself an expert in AI. And I think most of us in the software industry would fall into that category. But what I am is present in a company, like many, many other people, that is very, very interested in AI. And we're all, I think, at various stages of trying to understand how to use this absolutely transformative technology. I think the organization that I work in is being pretty forward thinking and being quite, aggressive about adopting AI, but still very much figuring it out. So we're very fortunate to have good investment to be able to understand what the tools are, what they can do for us, and try different things. And this is set across a backdrop of something that is moving so fast that you can figure out a way to do something and then find a week later that it's been obsoleted by a better way to do that thing. I think the other thing to touch on that's important is it's not just technical people, it's not just developers that are adopting these tools. As I look across the company, the people that I interact with, you've got obviously the development teams, but also slightly sort of crossing the line, you have the product teams that are looking at using AI tooling increasingly to help with planning, with writing features, requirements. You've also got business users that are using it for all kinds of purposes. It's been extremely useful for us, for example, in helping fill out RFPs, where you get those sort of questions in, people looking for a product, they ask you to fill out a lot of information about what your product does. So that can be an extremely time-consuming task. It's not uncommon to get hundreds of questions to answer in an RFP. And they're all every company will sort of present a slightly different list of questions. And it's something that I know a lot of architects spend a lot of time working on. And AI is really helpful there for accelerating that process. But yeah, how do you advise people? And how do you find the right tools for all of these different levels of experience? To what extent and how should we be educating people to use these tools and what they're capable of? Like, how much do you need to know how these things work? And I think it's incredibly helpful to know how they work. I mean, it kind of almost feels like magic. So, I'll get questions like, oh, if I use the AI prompt, will it be able to put in information about our products? Right? Well, where can it look to find that information? If a tool is just generally searching the internet and the information is not on the internet, then no, it's not going to be able to find it. But I think a certain level of user, they really need a lot of help to understand how to provide information effectively to a tool and what's safe to do it. Because in all of this landscape, security and sort of responsible use of AI is a really challenging problem. I read a story on the internet, one of many, of somebody that was sort of walking past a desk and watching a developer paste the output of database results straight into ChatGPT to ask problems. And that's got to be, every CISO's nightmare. By default, a lot of these tools will opt you in to using anything that you put in there to train future versions of their models. So, the privacy, the data exfiltration risk of these things is a really challenging thing to manage as well. So, some level of education is super important to make sure people are using the tools in a safe way. I think a lot of enterprises, certainly ours included, are providing safe versions of these tools. So self-hosting the models or using the sort of cloud hosting models like AI Foundry and Copilot from Microsoft to know that any information that goes into the model is sort of staying within a safe area. But people have access to these tools on their phone. They have access to them in their browser on their personal machines. And if you block them, we know that people will use these things. They'll find workarounds and they'll find hacks. So that education is really important.
I think that's the thing. It's kind of like one of the big things about AI is they're not deterministic. They're very open. You can ask it to do whatever. And like the example you gave before about there's lots of different questions. So AI really helps because it can work it out. It can infer stuff. And it's not like an if this happens, then that. It's not deterministic like we're used to in automation and programming. So that has huge productivity benefits, like you mentioned, but also it has security risks as well.
Big risks as well. I mean, even in answering those questions, right? I mean, fundamentally, this tool is making a prediction, and it's going to make things up for sure. I had a pre-sales person asking me, how we were using Java in one of our products, and then I said, "Well, we're not using Java. Why do you think we were using Java?" I said, "Well, I asked ChatGPT, and that's what it told me." There's literally no technical implementation detail on the public internet about our product, for good reason, because it's it's private IP. So yeah, you have to it's one of those things you have to educate people on. If ChatGPT doesn't know, it will very often make things up for you.
But ChatGPT says it must be right.
Yeah, it's scary. And it's a conversation that I have a lot with my developers as they're using AI more and more to help with coding tasks. The review process is so important. Looking at all the lines of code that AI has written. I was fascinated in your previous conversation. We were talking about having a robust DevOps environment such that you can take code that has been autonomously written by the AI offline, not in the coding assistant model, but in the handoff model. And it's so important to have that environment kind of, bulletproof so that you can trust that when the AI says it's done and your build pipeline says it's done, that it's actually done. I think that is an extremely, extremely challenging goal to be aiming for. I think, getting to the first sort of 95% of that level of reliability is relatively straightforward. It's the last 5% that is incredibly challenging, like closing all of those loopholes. And we know that as human developers, we constantly miss stuff, right? Nobody has no bugs on their board unless they also have no customers. You miss things. And I guess we definitely rely, or at least I certainly rely, on sort of a level of human intuition to sanity check the decisions that are being made in code. You can create some feature, for example, that works, that passes all of your tests, and even stands up to some amount of usage in a production environment, but it could be creating some latent issue. Like, for example, putting data into your database in a structure that is not sustainable. So it's going to work for maybe a week, a month, 6 months, and then it's going to hit some scaling limitation, which you can't solve just by adding more server. It requires a fundamental restructure of your data, and then it has a whole load of concomitant work to work out a migration strategy. And, it can be extremely, extremely painful. And yeah, I see lots of evidence of AI making decisions that would lead to that kind of outcome that then a human reviewer can pick up on and save on that potential problem. Sure, the humans can miss it as well, but I think I trust an experienced senior developer to be able to spot that kind of problem much more than I do AI right now. And, arguably we could say, well, we're not providing enough context, enough information to solve the problem. But I think it's really hard to close that last 5% to provide all of the information necessary to stop that kind of problem happening.
I guess it's kind of, as humans when we program, we have PRs and we have another human being, so someone else reviewing the code. So there's two people with their eyes on it. If AI is doing it, then it needs another person that's not maybe a human. Sometimes I would get another model reviewing that model's work and a human looking at a PR. So as much as you can automate this entire pipeline, having another human looking at the PR, ideally having an eyeball, another model looking at the PR, reviewing it, and just automating as much as you can, but just especially for things where is more complicated, and that human eye on it is important. Just fitting that into the pipeline, I guess. And I guess PRs are the perfect thing for that.
Yeah, and again, like what you can do here is improving all the time. We have GitHub Copilot Reviewer on automatically for all of our PRs now, and that's fantastic. It pretty much always picks up on some way that we can improve some code that we've written. But it's up and down again as well. I don't know if you use the PR summary feature, the PR description feature as well, to fill out what your PR actually is. The agent's quite smart. It will look at your commits and it will look at the actual change to come up with a summary description, which can help a subsequent reviewer. But I often find that it will emphasize some trivial detail of the PR as being significant and then completely miss the main objectives of the PR. And that can be a consequence of writing poor Git commit messages. I think there's a truism that the more trivial the piece of work that you're doing, the better your notes and commit messages are going to be. And you tend to get lazy on the bigger things that need a lot more explanation. But yeah, it seems that AI can make the same kind of mistakes and misses. But yeah, it speeds up the process. It's another tool that helps speed up the process. And it's very, very easy, I think, for a busy developer doing a PR review with a whole bunch of other stuff on to be less attentive than perhaps they should be in doing a PR review. So I think it's a really nice safety net that saves a whole bunch of time to have the an AI model doing a review of AI written code, for sure.
I'm curious, we've spoken a lot about different toolings, but what's your go-to model when doing development or reviews and stuff?
I kind of flick back and forth at the moment. I think my favorite tool is Claude Code, the CI variant of that, the command line variant of that. But we also have Copilot at work, which I use quite a lot. Sometimes actually that's a cost thing as well. So you've got a certain amount, we have a budget to work to. I use it quite aggressively. So having two different tools to use means that I can spread the cost around a little bit and take advantage of the number of credits that you sort of get for free before you're paying extra. And then within Claude itself, I'm usually using Sonnet 4.5. But then again, for planning, tend to pick a more of a thinky model. If it's a trivial task, then you can drop down to a lower cost model for something like Haiku. So going back to the using AI to help with tasks, there are certain kinds of tasks that I definitely feel a lot more confident, even relieved to be able to handle with AI in a more unattended way. So a really good example is security vulnerability patching. So like many organizations, we use tools like Sneak and SonarQube, which can generate reports on package vulnerabilities or lines of code sort of level kind of errors. And usually the context needed is quite small. I just need to upgrade a package version or I need to slightly change a couple of lines of code. So that's a really easy win to pass over to an AI, and the subsequent sort of PR review you need to do is pretty trivial when we have the tools in our build pipeline that goes and checks that the vulnerabilities have been removed. So that can be hugely time saving. And really, really important for us, the main product that I work on is a payments orchestrator. So it's dealing with financial services, and it's incredibly important to stay on top of the security in that landscape. So we invest a lot of time in that, and we've now saved a hell of a lot of time since AI has come along to help us. Another fun thing that I'm getting some really good stats out of is we've just had a new version of .NET come out. We have a policy in my organization of sticking on the LTS versions. Historically, we've had that policy. So most of our code is on .NET 8 Core right now. But the upgrade to .NET 10, we've been able to do with AI very successfully on some of our repos. And I think in the last cycle of upgrades, it took us about 4 months to get through all of our upgrades from 6 to 8. There were quite a few sort of additional things that we were doing as well as just a straight framework upgrade. But it wasn't the most important thing. It was important, but not urgent. So we took a bit of time to do it. I think this time around, we should be able to significantly reduce the amount of hours spent on that upgrade. It's literally been, do the upgrade for us and no issues found in the subsequent PR. So yeah, huge time saving.
Yeah, I tried that recently on one of our projects, and the only thing it got caught up a bit on is, the change with the async enumerable, where that's now built in rather than being a NuGet package.
Yeah.
So you get like two references, so the compiler gets confused. It didn't quite sort that out, but everything else it was fine. But yeah, it's just anything like that which you just don't want to do yourself. It's like, do it for me. It's kind of like grunt work, really.
Yeah, and again, it's another really good example of like having to spend some time to sort out and get the pipelines right. So if, for instance, we use secure package feeds, we don't just go straight to NuGet.org. We sort of use that pull-through model so that we can, keep an extra special eye on the packages that we're using. So we had to use a slightly different workflow to enable the GitHub coding assistant to be able to see our package feed that required some working out. So you do get tripped up by little things like that you have to spend a little bit of work on to get the pipeline nice and smooth. Another sort of really good use of AI for coding are sort of this sort of disposable tooling, I call it. So I'll give you an example. We have an observability platform that has a whole ton of dashboards on it, and we needed to make a change to how we record our metrics. The tool that we use for observability had a breaking change, which they were very good in telling us about, right, months and months in advance, but it crept up on us as these things sometimes do. And when we changed our metrics, which is a fairly trivial change, a whole load of the dashboards that reported on those metrics started sort of having, some of their graphs started to break. And we realized this had happened at the start of a morning stand-up. And by the end of that morning stand-up, using AI, I vibe coded a tool that downloaded all the dashboards, backed them up, fixed them, and re-uploaded them and verified that they were working. And that literally took less than 15 minutes from start to finish with AI. And, you could afford to have a sort of less of a level of care about tools like that when they're only going to exist to do one short job. So you can take off some of the safety nets that you might have put in place, a code that is going to have to be in production and running for a while. But, I do little tools like that all the time now. And it's completely changed my sort of personal time relationship with my computer, because I use software now to do. I already used it a lot, but I now use it so much more. I'm learning Japanese at the moment for fun. It's a really interesting language, and definitely recommend it. But I've coded a tool in the space of about 4 hours that would automate the process of creating flashcards for me. And not just sort of the flashcards I used to make myself with the English and the Japanese text in them. It's creating the words, translations, example sentences, adding notes, generating images to help me remember things, and creating, voice for all of the text as well, and then creating a package that I can import into the flashcards, very popular flashcards app that I use called Anki. And it's so much fun. So much fun.
Yeah, I remember when we had a catch up a few weeks ago, you were telling me about that, and started speaking Japanese to him, and it was like, how, given all the stuff you know anyway, and you've got time to also learn Japanese. I'm very jealous. I can't remember yesterday, let alone learn.
Well, Dan, I'm constantly impressed by your time management capabilities. I mean, for me, it's just putting aside an hour every day to do something that's not coding. It's actually quite refreshing.
I'm curious with the 4 hours that you mentioned to vibe code it. Was that 4 hours of your time or 4 hours of the AI model doing its thing?
Well, I think like a lot of vibe coding projects, it's maybe 4 hours is sort of both of our times. But my time is sort of spent looking at other things on the internet and carrying out other jobs and going to get cups of tea, and then sort of checking in when the prompt pops up for me to make a decision about some outcome and run a test. And actually, I think that's another thing that's worth commenting on. When you're using AI as a coding assistant, there's obviously a lot of rhetoric on the internet around. It's almost like two camps. It's kind of gradually polarizing, I think, between the people that think that AI is the answer and unattended coding is exactly where we're all going to head towards. And then sort of the skeptics that are saying, well, their encounters with AI have been less than stellar, and you've got, the sort of technical debt being added and bugs creeping in, and perhaps things that are not going to emerge as a problem for a while. And then you've got the horror stories about databases being deleted in production and so on. I'm definitely on the more optimistic end of the spectrum, I would say. I think there's a lot of hype and unbridled enthusiasm in AI circles. I would say I recommend bridled enthusiasm. So there's definitely lots of room for enthusiasm, but you need to be careful. And one of the areas where you need to invest that can make a huge difference is how you go about planning the work that you give to AI. So I think spec-driven development is hugely interesting. And that's one of the areas that's been moving quite fast and changing quite a lot, and how good the tools are at assisting you with a planning process. And there's obviously the GitHub spec kit, I think, is something that people would have heard of. Definitely worth having a look at. It's also increasingly easy to create your own sort of spec-driven development process. And that's something that I've done with Claude, where I create a whole bunch of custom commands that will walk through a spec-driven development process that's more suited to the way that we work. So, we use particular tools. We're quite heavy users of ADO for work item management, for example. So as we create features and tickets, that's where we want to see them. That's where we want to track their progress. There is a whole bunch of contextual information about the product that we work on that is incredibly useful for the AI to be aware of when you're asking it to draft requirements. So this sort of prompt management gets really important here, and getting the right information into the AI sort of context window when it's doing planning is really crucial. Managing that is a really important skill as well. So I think that's something we should probably come back to. But I'm now at the point where I can sort of have a command that will start off the process of developing a new requirement. It has context about my product. I can give it the basic outline of what business value the feature is intended to deliver, and have it go through the process of interactively working with me to fill out some of the details. And obviously it doesn't have to be me, it can be product people as well. To be able to draw on information from how the product works to help sort of get the level of detail right, be able to look at examples of other technical requirements drafts that we've done so that it can get the detail right. And then once you're in a happy place, the outcome of this is a well-formatted requirements document that follows the prescriptive sort of format, has all the right information, and has corresponding tickets in ADO. And then you can move on to the next step, which is to take those requirements and start building out a technical design. And again, the commands, the prompts help you walk through this interactive back and forth. So you've got very much human in the loop input into making the plan. And then you can go to the next step of actually then building up the detailed tasks. And then finally, at the end of that, once you've sort of approved the tasks, then you can go and get it to go and do implementation. And I definitely find for these more complex features, the ability to have the AI work at it in bite-sized chunks, going through each of those steps, having the review process. If you get at the end of that an appropriately detailed task that really sort of lays out in detail what you want the AI to achieve, your chance of getting like a first time good implementation that delivers on the feature goes up astronomically. Oftentimes I see people saying, well, AI is not going to work for us. It doesn't get it right, when they've put in a paragraph of information into the prompt and expect it to nail a complex, feature change just on that level of information. You have to give AI the same kind of level of information that you would have to give any product person, any development team that's going to work on a feature as a human. The tools to help us manage that process are evolving and getting better all the time.
Yeah, even like without the spec-driven stuff, it's kind of like I've like an example, a user story I recently did. I did it all as one prompt, and that pretty much worked first time. And I included that in my Git PR. And then when some of the other developers were looking at it, they were saying, "Oh, so this is how you do your prompts." Rather like when I normally do, just have a conversation with it and do bits and bobs at a time. But it's quite interesting that you've just got one big markdown file which is lots of context, and you're doing it one shot. Did that work? And mine was yes, it pretty much did it the first time. And I think having that as documentation as well, because like your prompt is really good documentation.
Yeah.
And as you say, adding all the as much context. So I find it interesting with, like with when people do putting AI aside for a second, if someone's to do a bug ticket in some ticket system, and one extreme might be someone saying it doesn't work, and then so you've got that whole thing where, okay, so what doesn't work? And then even if they add a bit more information, but if they spent 10 seconds thinking about, as I'm writing this, the person that's looking at it, have they got any obvious questions they're going to come back to me with? Make it so they don't have to ask those questions and that kind of thing. So that way of thinking, it's like, I don't want this to come back to me. I want to write as much context as possible so the other person that's dealing with this bug report can just crack on. When you're doing a prompt, have that same mindset. Just, has it got everything it needs? Does it have to come back and ask me anything? Is there any extra information or hints I can give it? I think that's quite powerful.
Yeah, and I think you do have to be very cognizant of the fact that context windows, you think of this like the short-term memory that an agent, an LLM has, they are limited. And you can make them quite big these days. Like, for example, Summit has the 1 million token context window option that, that you pay a bit more for, but I think the default is 100 or 200,000 at the moment. You can get a lot in that, but you will definitely fill it within a long session. And then, in order to manage that, these tools have sort of an automated compacting process, but that can sort of compact away important details. I think the more your context window is sat at full, it definitely impacts the precision of the output. So having a process like the one I described, which at each stage is creating sort of increasingly refined documents and ending up with a task document, which contains, the necessary and sufficient information to carry out the task, definitely helps with that. And I think it's partly because the tools are moving so fast. I do think that sort of the education, the documentation around what's going into your context window is not great right now. And I definitely find that not just non-technical people using these tools, but even the developers don't have as good a handle on what's going into their prompt window as they should. And if you're a user of Visual Studio Code and Copilot, then you probably already and use MCP tools, you've probably seen the warning to say, oh, you've got more tools than we recommend within selected for the agent. And that's because the metadata, the description about every tool that you have available through your MCP servers is going into the context window and is being sent. That information is being sent back and forth with every single request. It's going to take up a big chunk of window. If you run a tool that does a build, then all of the output of your build, which can contain hundreds of lines of completely irrelevant information, could end up being read back into the context window. That's why sort of tricks emerging like sub-agents within Claude that have their own context window. Sub-agents has come to Copilot now. I think it's a preview feature right now of deliberately trying, they're designed to try and solve that problem as well as allowing you to work in parallel. It's about having more focused agents that don't need to have all of the information on the task that's being worked on in context. It's a very real problem. Funnily enough, actually, I had our sort of internal equivalent of ChatGPT at work. That had a bug for a short while where a document that I had thought I'd removed from my workspace hadn't been removed. And elements of it were sort of creeping into the answers, like completely unrelated information showing up in the answers to questions. And it took me an hour to realize that I was getting sort of context leak. And the same thing can happen with tools. If you have a prompt file, there are a lot of different places where Copilot and Claude will look to get context information. And you can very easily, if you're not keeping tabs on it, leave a file in, which is going to get automatically included into every prompt, and that can color your results with unintended side effects.
I think even like going back to the start of our conversation where we're talking about security and what the models have access to, as like the different tools, like the MCP tools and stuff are becoming more and more and different. We're just getting used to giving the models access to more integrations to like stuff. And sometimes you mentioned in GitHub Copilot, the checkbox where you got the list of checkboxes of what tools are going to be included. I quite often find I go back to that and it's changed. It's like selected them all when I only like I keep having to unselect them all and then select the default section. And it's just for some reason it doesn't seem to remember that.
Yeah, I find that tooling very clunky at the moment in Copilot. I think it's much better in Claude right now. It's one of the reasons I prefer it.
My main client uses GitHub Copilot, so that's what we kind of use. We don't have a Claude Code subscription. But for my own stuff, I've recently got a Claude Code subscription, and I really like it. I just like in general using the CLI, although GitHub Copilot has got the GitHub Copilot CLI now, but it's not as mature as Claude Code. Yeah, it's just quite powerful. Going back to what you were saying about like spec-driven development and that GitHub spec kit, I had a quick play with that. Basically for a talk I'm doing at .NET Oxford that we mentioned earlier. I've decided I'm not going to use it because I want to do a live demo and it takes a bit longer to do that process. Mm-hmm. But I found it quite interesting how it separates out technical implementation details. So the initial spec is the requirement and what you want doing and why, not like how it gets done. And so you've got that spec. And then a bit later in that process you described, you've got the technical details and then tickets get created. But that initial spec, that could apply to whether it's in Blazor or React or Angular, whatever. It doesn't have a concept of what technology. So once you've got your spec and the requirements and everything, like as you said before, it's kind of like you can fire these things at AI, go and do something else. You're less bothered about throwing stuff away because you've not spent like weeks doing it yourself. So you can try, here's the spec, try it on these different platforms, see which one looks better or try it with different models, just play around and see which one you prefer out of the different things.
Yeah, I mean, that's the real advantage of separating out the process of requirements and technical design and the fine detailed tasks. And again, it's like having the tools that let you manage that information. So you could, for example, separately have a document where you're maintaining your sort of architectural principles, things like what architectural styles you prefer or what you want your tech stack to be. That can be something incredibly useful to maintain over time. And I think the tools are getting better at how you manage that information. You can now use things like marketplaces and plugins to enable you to store that information outside of your repository. So if you want to work like we do with a sort of microservice architecture, there's about 200 repositories, I think, that all have live codes that deploy into our solution. So what you don't want to do, I think, is copy all of that information into every single repository. You need a way of sharing it, but you need that to be safe. Like, you need to know what you're sharing across your team, and you don't want it to be a huge undertaking if you need to update some part of it that you then have to go and, people have to do a whole bunch of work to make sure they're on the latest current version of your standard. I think that kind of issue, working out the processes, that's more where non-AI enterprise companies are spending a lot of time and effort to try and figure out what that looks like. It's almost a separate problem to the building out AI and building out LLMs, but it's a very real part of the pain of developing in the enterprise.
Yeah. I'm actually getting quite nervous that we're going to run out of time before we get to talk about creating Claude code in 99 lines of code, did you say, in Microsoft Agent Framework. Can we talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So this was a demo that I sort of created for part of my own personal experimentation into trying to understand what the Microsoft Agent Framework was. So I should probably start by telling you a little bit about what it is and why it might be interesting. So clues in the name, it's an agent framework. So we should start a little bit with what an AI agent is. So I have a definition for this. It's a system that can autonomously perceive information, reason about what to do, take actions through tools or APIs, and then iterate until it achieves a goal. So instead of responding once to a prompt like a traditional LLM, an agent is typically going to operate in loops, planning, acting, observing results, and adjusting its behavior. And you could have more complex solutions that involve coordinating actions across lots of agents, managing state, ensuring reliability, handling failures, securing tool access, and observing what agents are doing while they're integrating with enterprise systems. I think that last part is important because as soon as you're sort of operating in enterprise, in business, there's a whole bunch of additional things that you need to worry about compared to sort of experimental tooling. So sort of the question becomes, how can we do that? How can we build agents reliably and safely in a way that's actually maintainable for production software systems? If you try and do that yourself, then there's a whole bunch of problems that you run into really quickly. How do you handle memory? What you don't want to do is end up building your own sort of conversation store state management system. How do you orchestrate calling all of the various tools? You don't want to have to end up building your own sort of reflection, parsing, and error handling logic to work with that. What if you need some kind of workflow? And that's sort of something we'll come back to. How are you going to see what's happening? You don't want debugging to just be looking at some blob of JSON. And there isn't really sort of a standard way to run agents. You're going to be writing your own sort of loop, retry system prompting system. You don't really want to be reinventing the wheel. So that's the kind of problem space that an agent framework is going to play into. And it's definitely worth saying that this is a new framework, but it's joining an extremely crowded space. There are lots of agent frameworks out there. I think one of the ones that's been around for longest, people probably heard of, is LangChain and its sort of companion LangGraph, which operates in Python and JS. And in fact, most of the frameworks out there target Python. There are quite a few that target JSON. And really, aside from Microsoft's contributions, there's much less in the .NET space. And as an organization, we are primarily .NET. So any framework that's targeting .NET is particularly interesting to me.
Am I right that this is the successor to Semantic Kernel?
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. So it's actually two frameworks that Microsoft had previously. We had AutoGen, which came out of Microsoft research. And I guess its primary focus is on multi-agent orchestration. And then Semantic Kernel, which you mentioned, which definitely focused more on enterprise integration skills and stateful workflows. So those teams have got together and sort of going for sort of putting the best of both into the Microsoft Agent Framework, which it's still in preview, so it's really fresh, really hot off the presses, but it's been getting a lot of love lately. It's definitely at a point where it's very much worth looking at. And it targets both Python and .NET. And even though I think there are some hints that they may expand that scope in future, I think that's an interesting decision because, languages aren't equal. Even just the availability of the different frameworks in different languages can drive different decisions. But that's where they are currently. They're trying to sort of keep things at feature parity. But I'm interested because it does offer .NET. And I have a lot of developers that work with .NET, and a lot of enterprise software obviously is written in .NET. It's good to have a framework that can target that space. So it has some really, really nice abstractions. It's very much designed around sort of open standards and interoperability. So it's easy to mix with other open source frameworks and platforms where it makes sense. It does, as you might expect from a Microsoft framework, it does give some particular love to things like Azure AI Foundry, which is a cloud hosting platform which enables you to host agents in sort of a safe sandbox, and again, solve a lot of those problems around security and safety and observability and testability and auditing that are very important in the enterprise. So, it's very good that it does that, but you are absolutely not buying in to having to use all of those things. If you want to use this framework, you can use it very much for any kind of agent hosting. There are a few abstractions that make up the core mental model in math. So the first thing is sort of the AI agent, and that's the heart of math, and that will let you sort of run reasoning rounds and call tools. So it gives you a very easy way to manage running your agent in a loop, to do tool calling, to do system prompt management, to model errors and recovery from errors, to have structured messaging, to lean into sort of the .NET's capabilities to have very clean typed inputs and outputs. It basically frees you from writing up a whole load of the boilerplate that you typically have to write with creating an agent. Another really nice idea that it has is how it manages memory. It has this idea of an AI agent thread. So you can have sort of one agent definition that's loaded into memory and run different threads through it, and each thread representing a separate conversation, a separate interaction. And so it has its own message history, has its own tool call history. And then there's optional persistent memory as well. So not just that sort of ephemeral thread of conversation, but you can plug in memory stores that you might need to have longer persistent memory. And that will work, for example, commercial services like Mem0. So you can have an external plugin. It's got abstractions for things like vector stores, chat reduction, that sort of compression thing that you see going on. You can have in-memory plugins, Redis, Cosmos, SQL. So that makes it so much easier to manage state and do things like, for example, persisting the entire agent state to some store and then rehydrating it later, which you might want to do if you've got some sort of long-running workflow step, for example. On the tooling front, it's got out-of-box support for plugging in MCP tools, A2A, and there's an emerging standard AGUI, which is sort of makes it much easier to plug AIs into user interface experience. And it's all strongly typed, very DI friendly within the .NET stack. So yeah, you can do with not a lot of code, you can take advantage of all of that. I think, an example of it's like less than, it's like 5 lines of code to go and plug in the GitHub MCP into your agent, for example. And that's including lines that just have a curly brace on them. Really good support for observability. So it really leans into OTel. It automatically will emit traces for prompts, model responses, for tool calls and inputs, for token usage, for error handling. It has support for security standards like Entra authentication and native components for sort of human in the loop steps, sort of approval steps as well. And that sort of leads me on to the workflow abstraction. So it's got a really nice workflow abstraction that would allow you to sort of add a graph of steps and nodes and edges, very similar to LangGraph, which has been around for a while, but it in a very, very sort of .NET friendly way. And you can either sort of build that up in code, or you can very easily use a more declarative approach of having workflows represented in JSON or YAML and loading them in. And workflow can be incredibly useful, again, especially in the enterprise space where you're trying to build an AI process where actually you don't want the AI to be completely freeform in how it's making its decisions, or you want to, for example, have agents carrying out steps in parallel. The company that I work for is in the insurance domain. So when you think about, for example, processing a claim, then you might want to be able to look up information about the policyholder from a secure system. So you do not want AI to have free reign to go looking into customer data. So you want to maybe hand that off to a separate tool to get only the appropriate information that's required. You might have another tool which is doing a form of risk analysis, or in the case of a claim where a customer might need rapid help, have another service which is calling out to do something like get a replacement car organized or book a hotel room, depending on what the nature of the issue is at hand. So having the ability to control that workflow and add some determinism to it and manage sort of the natural sort of randomness you get from a generative system can be incredibly useful. So yeah, math makes it very, very easy to add workflow abstractions, and it lets you do nice things very easily, like spit out visual representations, something like a graph viz diagram, for example, from your definition of a workflow. So yeah, that is math. And so with that abstraction in mind, it becomes very easy to do something fun like building a coding agent. There's a really nice set of samples in the repository, fully open source. So it's in GitHub. We'll get a link to the documentation into the show notes. And I think it's a really fun tool to play with. And if you're not happy with the kind of workflow that you get from Claude or Copilot in your dev process today, it might be a good choice if you want to build your own custom process around leveraging LLMs.
It does feel like where you mentioned this is very good in the enterprise. It feels like, because I had a quick play with it last week, and it's where obviously you spoke about a lot of stuff then, but actually it's not much code at all. It's quite like you new up an agent. From an agent, you can create a thread or whatever threads, or you don't have to, and then you can have a conversation with it. It's like very succinct code, and even just for personal like tooling to get stuff done, and just knocking up a .NET app and like having this stuff automate stuff, and it just feels like a really powerful thing to have in the toolbox. With like this Claude code in 99 lines, presumably you're just writing a console application which then sends those commands to the agents and then iterating on that.
Yeah, so obviously, just like Claude code itself, I mean, if you actually look at the footprint of these coding agents, they're very, very small. You only really need 3 tools to write a coding assistant. You need the ability to read the contents of the file. You need the ability to list the files and folders in a directory. And you need the ability to replace some content of the file with some other content. So it's literally 3 tools: read, list, and edit. And if you build those, which is pretty standard file system stuff, and make them available via the tooling abstraction to the agent, then you just need to say, you're a coding assistant, here are your tools, and it will work. It is like magic.
Did you use Spectre Console?
I didn't in this case, because I think that would have pushed me over the target of getting it under 100 lines of code. But that is a trick that I use quite often. I know you're a fan of saying make it look pretty with Spectre Console, and it is a good tip and works very well. Yeah, I tell you what I vibe coded the other day that I did use Spectre Console for. If you're anything like me, you've almost got down into muscle memory this sequence of operations that you go through when you want to create a new, even throwaway project. So in the .NET space, I'm a big fan of VS Code and the command line. So I will initialize my GitHub repository, generate the gitignore file, add in an editor config file, create a top-level solution, create a source folder, put the project that I want to make with the right template type in the source folder, add it to the solution, usually turn on central package management if I know I'm going to have more than one project in place, which then involves manipulating all of the package references. So yeah, I've coded up a tool. All I wanted it to do was figure out the various prompts that you get when you create a new template. So if you create a new Blazor app, for example, do you want to have a program class, or do you want to go with the top level statement approach? Do you want to include security, HTTPS or not? There's a bunch of different relevant choices for almost every sort of framework type. So the bit of magic I put in was automating all that stuff that's pretty much the same every time, but then looking at the help, getting the list of templates, looking at the help for them, and then interactively prompting with Spectre Console for the choices that were the interesting choices in those templates to go and accelerate that process. So, what used to take me maybe 10 minutes now takes me about 10 seconds, but it's 10 minutes I'm saving over and over and over again because I'm always creating throwaway projects like that.
I love these little tools that as developers we can create. I've got one for the podcast where, in fact, when we finish recording and we've got off, then I always run it after recording. It's a podcast bootstrapper called it. I just run it locally, so .NET Run, and it first asks me what the episode number is, what the title is, and then that's pretty much it. And then it opens up Windows Explorer, an empty folder, says copy the WAV files, which I'll download from Riverside, into this folder, then press enter. So I do that, and then it copies that into the place where I put the episode, copies my template Adobe Audition file, which I use as a template thing, into there, copies the intro music and everything it needs in. Then it will take a backup, because obviously then I do processing on the audio and stuff. So all of these different steps, it just like runs through and does them. So again, it's kind of like you said, it's something that manually would have taken a while, and I would have probably put off because it's kind of like, that's going to take a while, I'll do it tomorrow or something. Or actually now I do it straight after the recording because I just .NET Run, go, and it does it for me.
Yeah. And I find I'm naturally sort of getting better and better at figuring out the right amount of context to give the tool, so that doesn't become a massive time sink rabbit hole. I definitely had a few of those over the last couple of years, where you sort of start off with perhaps a slightly too ambitious prompt, and it would end up building not quite what you wanted, and you'd end up going down sort of this rabbit hole of a mess that you'd have to unpick later, and quite oftentimes end up sort of throwing away and starting again. I definitely find as well, I think we touched on this earlier, having your process with AI regularly make commits as it goes along, so that you can step back and go down the right path on the fork that you hit maybe a half an hour previously, can be extremely useful.
Yeah, definitely. I think Git well, it's always been such a powerful thing, should like commit often and everything, a powerful tool. But I think when AIs are doing stuff, especially like locally, I found that when I'm using Claude Code or something CLI based, so rather than Git Copilot in VS Code from like Claude Code, I would quite often be alt tabbing between the CLI and my Git client. I use Git fork, but I know you're a fan of Git on the CLI anyway, so you can stay into the CLI. But I tend to like be alt tabbing between the two. So I've got the Claude Code agent, tell it what to do, and then I'll toggle between my Git client so I can see what changes it's made, commit it so I've got a snapshot, and then iterate on it if required. Again, it depends on what I'm doing. Like quite often I'll try and, as we said, have like as much context in the prompt file and let it do it one shot, but sometimes I've got to iterate. And when I'm iterating as well, sometimes if I've got to tell it something wrong, I quite often find that if I then tell it saying, because I've got this prompt file on disk, the things we've just discussed that you got wrong, update the prompt file so you don't make this mistake again.
Yeah.
It will go and do it, and then I can throw it all away and start again. And I know that it's kind of like it's much more likely to get it right with that new version of the prompt.
Yeah, absolutely. And things like Git work trees as well open up the possibility, which we use quite a lot of. If you're not quite sure how you want something to look, then you can set 3-4 agents off on the same job in parallel on different work trees to try different variations of an approach. Particularly interesting when you're doing UIs, for example. Although I do find that if you don't provide too much guidance, AIs seem to love purple and blue themed user interfaces.
Does that depend on what technology you're using? I wonder if, the Blazor default template, how that kind of, that's, a Blazor app when you see it, unless it's been heavily themed.
No, I've seen it in Python, Node, JavaScript, and .NET UIs. I don't know what it is. It's something about purple and blue seems to scream AI. I noticed actually even the highlight borders on the podcast recording tooling we're using are purple and blue.
I suppose Riverside has been around for longer, but maybe they've got it to make it look like AI, make this look more pretty, and then it's added some purple and stuff.
Yeah. One interesting anecdote I have again, which I think stresses the importance of that sort of human experience. I was solving a problem the other day, actually putting an enhancement into some existing software. And this is a service that processed messages off of a service bus. So it did some logic and then would come up with a response and put that back onto service bus. And we needed to have a new type of branch in the code. So I asked AI to code that, gave it sort of a suitable briefing, and it produced working code. And it was passed all the tests absolutely fine. And I was reviewing the implementation, and it was really interesting. The original author of that code, sort of left the company years previously, had done something which I think can be a little bit of an anti-pattern, where there was sort of several levels of nesting in function calling. And sometimes if something had sort of was not on the happy path, then the code would send an error message in response from this deep level of nesting in the code, would publish this response message and then return a null, or even worse, throw an exception that would then be caught by the original calling method, which would then go, oh, this is a null response, I'm done, and just return. And essentially, with what we're talking about here are functions that have side effects. And there were some sort of deeply nested side effects going on. So you've got a message handler, which is essentially going to receive a message, processes it, and then return some kind of response. That's the flow. But you couldn't see that looking at the code. What you could see in the code was go and call some function, maybe get a result. If I get a result, do some more work and send a response message, happy path. If I don't get a result, then assume that there's some problem that has been handled. And the AI was just repeating that pattern. So the new sort of more complex logic I put in, it ended up getting buried sort of several levels of nesting deep. But what I was then able to do was enhance my prompt. I was able to sort of have a conversation with the AI agent and say, could you take a more sort of pure function approach to this? so that you execute the logic, get a result, and then decide what to do with it in terms of sending the response message. And with that prompt in place, the previous code as well was massively cleaned up, and it became really easy to look at and see the logic and the flow of the code. And that's an example of what I'm talking about, where you can get this level of technical debt, which is sort of baked into code that passes all the tests, that works just fine. But I think not only for humans, it's also going to be challenging for an AI to come back to that code later, which has got a level of psychomatic complexity which is much higher than it needs to be. The chances of making an error in subsequent edits go up. And that's where, if somebody's using AI all the time and they haven't had the experience, they haven't sort of, earned their experience by writing code and making mistakes and learning from them themselves, but are leaning into AI, where do you plug that gap? And I don't think we've got an answer to that yet. I think there's a lot of, doomsaying out there around there'll be no jobs for junior engineers. And, I've seen a lot of interesting research to say that perhaps whilst junior hiring is down, that might be for other reasons than for AI. Maybe it's contributing, but I don't think it's the entire story. But we do have to think about how do we retain our critical thinking as we use AI more and more. And I think that review process is very important. And actually, writing code to learn how to do it is really important. There are those that say that moving to spec-driven development means that could end up, that's all we're doing, is creating specs. I think that's quite a long journey if we get there. And it does smack very much. I remember in the early noughties, there was a lot of hype around then model-driven execution, where you also use computer-aided design tools, the likes of sort of beasts like Rational Rose, if you remember that, where you would describe your entire software in models using UML. And the promise was you wouldn't have to write code. You just create the model, and then you would run the model. But just like those models, specs are a higher level of abstraction. The reason why we have code, the reason why we have programming languages is because that provides the necessary and sufficient level of detail to fully describe the solution to a problem. So if you don't provide that level of detail by writing the code yourself, then the AI is going to be doing some degree of gap filling. It's going to be sort of making up and making decisions that you're not party to as to how it fills out those spaces. And I think it's not always going to make the right decisions. And it's going to make decisions that leads to the technical debt that I've been talking about, that you don't see if you're only spending your time at the level of specifications. So I think the journey to closing that last 5% that I talked about, to getting to the point where you can trust AI not only to produce working code, but to produce maintainable code, that is a really, really hard problem, I think. I think it's much harder than some people are suggesting. But it's a fascinating space. And I have no doubt that there is a lot of progress to be made. But I also do not fear for the role of architect or software developers for quite some time to come.
Yeah, I don't think experienced developers are going to lose their jobs or not be defined their jobs soon. I do think the junior developers, it's a problem we need to solve, because companies are definitely thinking, well, do I need to hire these junior developers if AI can do the kind of stuff they would have been given, which isn't a long-term solution. But I think generally as software developers, if we stay on top of what's happening with AI, companies are desperate for people that can use AI. So I think that is definitely a good place.
Yeah. And certainly, I hear much more about businesses getting excited about their potential to do more and do it faster. There's no shortage of work to be done. I look at sort of the product roadmaps that we have in any company I've ever worked in. There have been, very ambitious product roadmaps going out months, if not, in fact, usually years. So the prospect of being able to get on top of that with AI, I think that's what's really appealing to businesses, not reducing their headcount. It's about being able to do more with what they have and deliver, more value faster.
Yeah. And also a company that's, as you described, they're going to have competing companies and their staff are using AI as well. So those companies are going faster and faster. So it's not like a company is using AI and competing with a company that's no one else is using AI, it's just us. So everyone's going faster. So everyone's going to need the skill set within people they hire that can leverage it.
Absolutely. It's, that's just sort of one step bigger, the same argument. It's not AI is going to replace you. It's people using AI are going to replace you. The same thing applies to companies. Yeah.
And just going back to what you were saying about your consumer, the messaging example thing. So you obviously have got the experience to know that you saw that issue and you prompted it saying, okay, make it more functional. So that's one aspect. You've got people writing the prompts need to know what they're talking about. And then you've got the other aspect where like models have been trained on a lot of public source code, like GitHub repositories, which are probably not the perfect code. It's been written by people doing hobby code and things.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think so. The vast majority of code out there that these agents have been trained on is absolutely not good.
Yeah, and then we're going to get more and more code that's written by AI that's in GitHub that's been written by AI that's trained on that stuff we're talking about that's in GitHub.
Compounding the issue.
Exactly, yes.
But I mean, I would say as well, AI is a great tool for educating you on code. I mean, I certainly can't hold in my mind everything about all the technology I've ever looked at, let alone the stuff that I've never looked at. So, the ability to be able to ask AI to literally create me a tutorial on this aspect of this product is hugely productive. But yeah, I think where we are going to learn, interestingly, I think it's almost going to shift right? Because if you learn from a compiler error, that's like a very quick way to learn something. You write a line of code that even sort of the inline IntelliSense tells you that's not right. You're learning there. That disappears when you're using AI assistance. You don't make those mistakes anymore. So you lost that learning opportunity. Then you run your compile, you run your unit tests. If the AI is now doing that for you and iterating on that till it's passed, then you've lost that learning opportunity. And in fact, if you sort of follow that through and go back to this 95.5% problem, the first time you're seeing issues now becomes extremely complex technical debt, long-term sort of bedded in issues that you weren't able to catch with your sophisticated automated testing environment, which, by the way, did you know how to build in the first place without all of that experience? Yeah, it's making it much harder to find the people that have the requisite experience to solve those kind of issues. So I don't have the answers. I don't know what the answer is here, but we do need to. I'm very conscious that we need to pay attention to maintaining people's critical thinking skills and their learning.
Yeah. Another thing with the learning I find works quite well is if I ask, ChatGPT or whatever it is, I want to make sure I know everything about this topic, whatever it is, ask me questions to make sure that I know, as in, rather than me asking it questions, I'm getting it to ask me questions. Almost do like a gap analysis of my knowledge.
Yeah, that's a really helpful part, again, of the sort of the spec-driven development process, where at each sort of approval stage, the AI prompts only that I use are saying, ask clarifying questions to make sure that you've got a complete understanding before, you're going to approve this stage of the process.
Nice. I'm aware that we're kind of like way over time, which always happens when we talk. We're just chat about technology and geek out, which is always great conversations. Before we move on to dev tips, was there anything that we've not covered that you want to cover?
So another really nice feature of the Microsoft Agent Framework is it has something called the Dev UI. It's actually packaged up as a package that you can include in your web applications to test out your agent. So even if you're writing something that's going to be like an unattended service, if you want to see how it behaves, you can include the Dev UI package. You can drop your AI agent derived class into that, just adding it as a dependency. And then you get this entire console that props up, which shows all the agents that you've added. You can start a conversation with it, and you can see on the screen a trace of all the tool calls it's made, all of the sort of the chat interactions and the history appearing. It's an incredibly useful diagnostic tool for understanding how your agent works and tweaking the prompting and so on.
Oh, nice. So is that just local development, or would you also use it in a deployed thing as well?
It's packaged into the framework, so it's there for you to add as a package, but it's also open source, remember, so it could act as a really good starting point for a custom user interface that you'd like to make. So on the .NET side of things, that's written in Blazor. But yeah, you could use it as the basis for making your own user interface if you wanted to have an interactive agent with a user experience. Absolutely. And it's really nice as well, sort of the streaming chat coming through and presenting, code in Markdown automatically, that kind of thing.
Oh, nice. I started playing with Microsoft Agent Framework last week, going through the Microsoft Learn tutorial, but I've not got too far yet. So a lot of it was just starting chats and interacting with it. I didn't really get to the point, and the image processing as well. I didn't really get to the point where it's that Dev UI or a lot of the other stuff you spoke about. So I really need to continue that journey because it does seem quite powerful. And that Dev UI sounds really interesting. Well, shall we jump into dev tips then?
Yeah. So my dev tip is I think I'm certainly in the .NET Oxford circles known for my favorite tip for many years, which was always read the exception. It's always been surprising to me how often developers will get a problem and go, oh, it must be this, and try something and rerun, and no, it wasn't. The same error sort of crops up, and they've actually missed. If you actually took a look at the stack trace, the exception, whatever you have available, that will often tell you what the solution to the problem is. My dev tip is to try and adapt that for AI times. We talked a little bit about this call on the importance of prompt management and not polluting your context window with irrelevant information. So one of the things that I have now is I always have a sub agent, which is like a test running specialist. So that will run the tests. And certainly in our build processes, there are potentially hundreds, if not thousands of lines of output that can come from a test run. But when there's a problem, what we ask the agents to do is just take the context of the problem, the few lines that's relevant to the test that is failed, and then return that information back to the parent agent. So what it gets when it does a test run is either all tests passed, or this was the test that failed and this is the exception trace. So it has just the information it needs, and you're kind of forcing it to actually react appropriately to the problem and not pollute its context window.
Nice. It's funny when you say about sub-agents and parent agents, for the listeners that haven't used that kind of stuff, that sounds like really complicated. But actually in Claude Code, you can just / create agent and then give it some English to describe what that agent does. So it's not as complicated as it sounds.
Yeah, walks you through the process. Sub-agents are just another prompt file. Actually, and the other thing that you can do with the sub-agent that's really useful is you can restrict the tools it has available to it, which is another way of keeping the context window and the behavior of the agent tightly focused.
Nice. Just very briefly, because I realised we spoke about Claude Code and Sonnet 4.5 and stuff. Recently, Opus 4.5 has been released. I saw an infographic the other day where it was like a joke one where it had like OpenAI, Anthropic, another one, and it's like a loop going around, like a one saying, we've just released the world's most powerful coding model, and then the other one says the same thing, and then it's got like a you are here kind of thing over Anthropic, because that's just been released, and it's just this cycle of them trying to beat each other.
Well, my other secondary tip is that they say, again, to remind you that not all agents are charged the same. If you're a Copilot user, for example, then there's quite a useful, I think they even put it in the UI now, there's a little the credit multiplier is listed against the agent, so you know how much you're spending. I've definitely had more than one occurrence of a developer running out of their premium credits by inadvertently sticking on an expensive thinking model that's sort of charging at 10x times the credit consumption.
Well, it's good you've got a cap there, so it's run out of credits rather than we've just been charged £10,000 or whatever.
Yeah. I'm waiting for I can't do my work this month because I've run out of AI.
I've not had that yet, which is, I feel maybe I'm not using AI enough then. I am using it a lot, but maybe not enough.
Well, Dan, in your case, if that happens, then you remember how to write code, right? So
not anymore. I can't remember yesterday. It's kind of like So my dev tip is, well, it's actually just a quote from, I saw a tweet someone had, or X tweet or on Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter. It was a tweet that someone wrote, which I just quite like the phrasing, and it fits in with all our like career advice thing about making sure that you like know what you're talking about. And I'll include a link in the show notes. I've not actually got in my notes who wrote it, so I'll have to find it. But the most important piece of career advice: be the person who can figure it out. You will be given tasks that you have no idea how to complete. There's nothing more valuable than someone that can just figure it out. Do some work, ask key questions, get it done. People will fight over you.
Yeah, very true.
I think it was just very well written, because it's true. If you, I think a lot about different people's mindsets where, say you've got a bug, one person might be working on that bug and just getting really frustrated and getting cross with it, saying it just should work, why is it doing this, and just getting really frustrated. Another mindset you might have is, it's a problem I've got to solve. It's exciting. I'm not going to let it defeat me, and that kind of thing. Those are the same problem, but two different mindsets. And it's actually quite easy to change your mindset if you decide that you're going to be that latter mindset. And actually, I generally find when I intentionally do that, I enjoy solving that problem a lot more, and I do it much faster rather than getting frustrated and procrastinating and finding other things to do. So I thought that was quite a nice. Let me just quickly find, because I realised I've not really said who tweeted it, because I didn't put it in my notes, but I just want to make sure I give credit. I very recently retweeted it, so I'm going to find it quickly. Yeah, it's by someone called Sahil Bloom, and I will link to that in the show notes. Cool. So before we wrap up, where's the best place for listeners to reach out if they've got any questions?
So you can put a link to my LinkedIn in the show notes. That's generally where I spend most of my social networking time these days. I will endeavour to be on your Discord as well. So
Nice.
And if you want to see me in person, and Dan as well, obviously, then do come along if you're in the area to the next .NET Oxford as well.
Does that mean I've got to edit this episode before the 9th of December?
Yeah. You can decide whether to clip that bit out or not. Yeah, I've added into the show note links just now, links to the GitHub for the agent framework, the Microsoft Learn page for it, a link to SpecKit, and also to my LinkedIn profile.
Oh, nice. I'll make sure I include all of those in the show notes. And a big thank you everyone for listening. A quick reminder that this podcast is sponsored by Everstack, which is my own company providing software development and consultation services. For more information, visit everstack.com. And if you're enjoying this podcast, please do help me spread the word on the socials. I normally use the hashtag Unhandled Exception, and all of my socials can be found on my website, danclark.com. And as we mentioned before, we'll include a link to all the things we've mentioned today in the show notes, which can be found on unhandledexceptionpodcast.com.